35 collect 100 gallons of rainwater for $15. The Amish barrel setup the county doesn't want you. To build rain hits the barrel like it remembers the roof above it. You can hear it before you understand it. 100 gallons doesn't sound like much until it's yours. Then it feels like a hidden tank sitting under the sky. There's a simple setup beside this shed that costs less than $15. Most people walk past materials like this every single day. Water runs down a warped hose, slipping into a dark plastic drum. No pump, no noise. Just gravity doing what it always did. Why does something this simple feel like it shouldn't work? And why do old rural hands treat it like common sense while modern systems ignore it? There's a reason it gets called an Amish barrel method, though the name misses the point. It's not about who used it first. It's about what they refuse to waste. And once you see where the water actually comes from, you stop looking at rain the same way again. There's a kind of quiet knowledge in setups like this. The kind you don't really learn. You just notice one day when something breaks and you fix it. Simpler than before. If you've ever patched, rebuilt, or kept something running longer than it should lasted, that kind of thinking belongs here. Say where you're watching from, and what you've kept alive with your own hands. People read those stories later and learn more than any instruction can give. Rainwater doesn't ask permission when it finds its way down a roofline. It just moves, straight and patient like it's done for 1,000 years before us. Out here beside the shed, a dark barrel takes every drop without complaint, and the sound alone feels older than the house behind it. There's a hose shoved into a rough opening, sealed with tape that's already been through a few seasons. Nothing about it looks refined. But it's working, and that's the part that stops you. The water doesn't rush in like a machine-fed system. It drips, then flows, then settles. A slow fill that feels almost intentional, like the barrel is remembering how to hold something again. Most people would walk right past this setup without thinking twice. That's what makes it strange. The simplest things are often the ones we stop trusting first. There's a number that sticks in your mind once you hear it. 100 gallons. Not stored in metal tanks or buried systems, just gathered from the sky and something you could carry with a wheelbarrow and a Saturday afternoon. And still, the question doesn't leave. Why does it look too simple to be real? The hands that built this weren't careful in the modern sense. They were steady in the old sense, the kind of steady that comes from fixing things instead of replacing them. I remember watching something like this years ago behind a barn where nothing matched and nothing needed to. An older neighbor had barrels lined up like quiet soldiers, never threw one away, not if it still held water, grain, or time itself. He said once, not as advice, just as observation, rain already pays you. Most folks just don't collect it. That line stayed longer than the memory of his face. What you're seeing here isn't a finished idea. It's a habit made visible, a roof, a gutter, a barrel, 3 things most homes already own in pieces. But something about combining them feels almost overlooked. Like it was never meant to be complicated in the first place. Still, there's a tension under it. Because if this really works the way it looks like it works, then a lot of what we've been told about water storage starts to feel heavier than it should. And that's where the story begins to shift, because the barrel isn't the strange part. It's the roof feeding it that changes everything, not yet explained, just noticed. And once you notice it, you start seeing water everywhere it used to disappear. The moment you start paying attention to the roof, everything else gets louder. Not in sound, but in meaning. Every storm becomes movement you're not using. Water sliding off shingles, racing down gutters, vanishing into soil like it was never meant to stay. It's strange how normal that looks until you pause long enough to question it. Most homes are built like they're throwing something away without noticing. A heavy rain makes it more obvious. Gutters can't hold it all. They spill at the corners, overflow at weak joints, dump clean water straight into dirt that doesn't care. You can stand there and watch it happen for hours and still feel like you're missing the part where it becomes useful. That's what changes once you start thinking differently. Nothing about the system is broken, it's just unfinished. And that's the quiet realization that tends to settle in. Most houses already have half the work done. Roof, gravity, flow. The expensive part people imagine, pumps, filtration towers, sealed tanks, that's all optional layer on top of something already working in plain sight. But modern habits don't like half-finished. They like packages, systems, kits with instructions and guarantees. And that's where the disconnect starts to show, because rain doesn't wait for packaging. I knew a man once who fixed tractors for a living. Retired now, hands still stained with old grease that never fully left the skin. He didn't talk about water systems like projects. He talked about them like habits you either noticed or ignored. After a utility bill spiked one summer, he started placing barrels under every downspout he had. No ceremony, no planning board, just action. He said something simple while tightening a cracked fitting. Not loud, not proud. If it falls free, I'm not paying twice to ignore it. That kind of thinking doesn't come from theory. It comes from watching things get more expensive without getting more useful. And slowly, you start seeing why simple setups survive longer than polished ones. The word Amish gets attached to methods like this, but it's less about identity and more about refusal, a refusal to overbuild what already works. Tradition holds that many rural communities kept water collection simple because complexity didn't earn its keep, not because they lacked tools, but because they valued repair over replacement. There's no mystery in it when you strip it down, just gravity, containers, and attention. But attention is the part most systems don't sell you. Now, it would be dishonest to pretend this solves everything cleanly. It doesn't. Cold weather changes behavior, water expands, cheap barrels can crack if placed poorly or left exposed through hard freezes. Algae can form if sunlight hits the wrong surface for too long. These aren't rare problems, they're normal ones. And anyone building this learns them the same way people have always learned, by adjusting after the first mistake. That's the honest limit of it. It works best when you respect its simplicity, not when you try to turn it into something permanent and sealed like factory storage. Still, the materials don't ask for much. Food-grade barrels show up in farm sales, storage yards sometimes left behind after bulk deliveries. Old containers get repurposed more often than people realize because they already passed the hardest test, holding something safely once before. And once you start noticing them, you stop seeing trash. You start seeing volume, potential, stored time waiting for a second use. That's the shift that matters more than the build itself. Because the barrel under the roof isn't really the point. It's the moment you realize how much water has been passing over your property your entire life without ever being spoken for. And once that thought settles in, you stop looking at storms the same way again. The table is simple enough that it almost feels unfinished on purpose. A barrel on its side, a spigot, a short length of hose. A strip of mesh that looks like it came off an old window screen. Nothing here asks for approval, nothing needs instruction manuals stacked beside it. It all sits in that quiet category of things that only look obvious after someone else has already done the thinking. Gravity does most of the work. That's the part people overcomplicate first. Water doesn't need encouragement, it needs direction, a slight tilt, a low point, a place to settle instead of scatter. You set the barrel under the runoff where the roof naturally speaks the loudest during rain. Not the prettiest spot, the most honest one, where water already lands when no one is watching. That matters more than precision. The inlet doesn't need to be fancy. Just something to keep leaves, twigs, and roof grit from turning the inside into a mess after a few storms. A piece of mesh, a scrap of cloth stretched tight, enough to slow debris, not stop flow. At the base, the spigot goes where your hand would naturally reach. Not higher, not centered, just practical. You want water to leave when you ask it to, not when it feels like it. There's a satisfaction in tightening that first connection. Not loud, not dramatic. Just a small resistance turning into a seal. A moment where something stops leaking into nothing and starts becoming usable again. Most of this kind of setup lands somewhere around the price of a cheap meal out. In my case, it came together from leftover pieces and a few things pulled from storage bins that hadn't been opened in years. $15 is the number people remember, but the real point is how little of it felt like buying anything new, and then you wait for rain, not because it's required, because it confirms everything. When it finally comes, you hear it before you see it working. The soft hit of water on plastic, then the change in tone as it begins to collect instead of scatter. That sound carries a kind of quiet reward with it, like the land is paying attention again. There's a moment that's hard to explain unless you've built something like this yourself. You turn the spigot and water comes out that you didn't purchase, didn't filter through a bill, didn't argue for on a statement. It just arrives because you gave it somewhere to go. That feeling is the real reason people keep building systems like this, even when they already have access to city water or wells. It's not about replacing anything. It's about remembering you can still participate in your own supply in a small, steady way. Now, I won't pretend this setup is perfect. It isn't sealed like commercial tanks. It needs cleaning, it needs attention after heavy storms. If you ignore it too long, nature will quietly reclaim it with algae or sediment. That's the trade. Simplicity always asks for maintenance instead of automation. There was a man I knew who tried to improve his setup too much. Added valves, extra filtration, overbuilt brackets. It worked for a while, until the first hard freeze twisted one joint just enough to crack the whole line. He ended up going back to something closer to this. Fewer parts, fewer points of failure. That's the pattern you start noticing. The more complicated it gets, the more fragile it becomes. And the strange part is, once you've seen it working in its simplest form, you stop trusting the urge to overbuild it again. Because the system isn't really about barrels or fittings or even rain. It's about whether you're willing to let simple things stay simple long enough to work. And once that question settles in your mind, the next thing you start thinking about is how far this can actually go.